Chapter 1261, Stop. Old Brahma. Niavon's voice boomed. His figure loomed high in the skies, looking every bit the part of Buddha. His belly was a shimmering mass of rounded gold, a halo pulsing vertically to his back, looping in a wide arch that looked more like a gate to heaven than an extension of a man's body. He was larger than life, greater than the skies, and a single palm from him should have shattered a small figure like old Brahma to pieces. And yet, it had been days of no movement. Standing there alone, old Brahma seemed to remind him of the olden days, days where he took the council by the horns and stood as the foremost expert of the Golden Grove, a man not just known for his battle prowess, but his wit and intelligence. The very best rune master in this galaxy. A palm struck down from above, only smaller than the enormous golden tree that held up the skies. Old Brahma's eyes flashed, his aura flaring. The mechanical parts and turning gears of his armor accelerated like roaring engines, sparks flying from him as he cocked his arm back. Clink, clink, clink. His arm pulled back in 3 sections, each one adding more tension until he suddenly erupted. Boom. A fist of concentrated centripetal force took shape and ripped a void through the air. It poked a hole through Niavon's palm in a single bound. At first, it looked like a tiny needle ripping through a large blanket, doing nothing at all. But then the palm imploded, falling into a scattered rain of gold. Niavon's expression twisted with darkness. Yao Yao, are you going to continue to do nothing? Niavon barked. I don't appreciate your words, Niavon. I have done my best. But he is not attacking and is entirely focused on defense. We don't stand a chance in this situation. He understands the laws of this world better than all of us, and he's forged his mechs to take perfect advantage of it. That attack hadn't ripped the void with pure power. His mech calculated the weakness in the mesh of reality, adjusted 3 times in a split second, and then punched out, perfectly targeting not just the weakness in the world, but the weakness in Niavon's attack as well. If the mesh of reality was disrupted, skills were far less effective, and old Brahma was a master at taking advantage of this. The problem was that in normal combat, this was especially hard to use. However, if he focused entirely on defense, protecting something to his back and waiting for the danger to come to him instead, his ability to read, react, and calculate increased severalfold. You think I don't know this? The only way to beat him is to tire him out first. If you're just standing there, doing nothing, how are we going to? Niavon's words were caught in his throat as he realized that Yao Yao wasn't looking at him or old Brahma anymore. Instead, her gaze was focused on the golden tree that had been the center of their world for so very long. It shook. Slowly, a new portal opened up for the first time in many days. The entire region had been locked down by old Brahma, and practically the whole province had to be cleared so that there wouldn't be any casualties beneath the battle of these sea tiers. And then Silas slowly walked out, an unconscious Megan in his arms. Other than a slight paleness on his face and streaks of dried blood on his cheeks, he looked as though he hadn't been through much at all. Well, if the ravaged state of his clothing hadn't been a dead giveaway. Calm and patient, he took one step after another, appeared before old Brahma, and looked down at the old man. At some unknown point, Silas had walked into the air as though it were flat ground, until he reached the same height as old Brahma's mech. He didn't say a word, but old Brahma's heart was shaking so violently even his mech almost lost control. Although he had planned for all of this, it was like he didn't expect that it would work out at all. He nearly lost all composure. However, seeing the indifferent chill in Silas' gaze, he knew that there was no getting out of this. Maybe Silas would even kill Megan right in front of him to prove a point if he so much as tried. Usually, a C tier would find such a thought to be a joke. The gap between F tier and C tier was so enormous it might as well have been the difference between an ant and a god. But, by this point, old Brahma knew that the last person he should underestimate was Silas. It was only a brief moment, a momentary lapse. But after that, old Brahma held his hand up to the skies, his mech following his actions. I swear on my life itself that I will follow all of your orders so long as it brings no direct harm to my granddaughter. The skies rumbled, sparks of lightning taking shape and an oppressive system might falling. Silas had accidentally triggered a system oath before, but that one had felt far less substantial than this one. Maybe because the scope was wider, maybe because the system was far stronger here, or maybe it was because old Brahma himself was so much stronger than he was. Likely, it was a combination of all three. Once Silas felt the oath take root, he handed Megian's unconscious body over, and old Brahma carefully scooped her up into a palm. By the time he had snapped out of the soft gaze he was giving his precious granddaughter, Silas was already leaving. Did you? That's none of your concern, Silas said calmly. Old Brahma's eyes flickered. Stop right there. Niavon still stood high in the skies, his aura pulsing out waves of gold. How could they just allow this? Chapter 1262, Dominus. Silas actually did stop, to old Brahma's surprise. He looked back, meeting Niavon's gaze with calmness. Is there a problem? You entered our. According to our contract, there shouldn't be anything you're capable of hiding from me in the first place. Are you saying you want to break it? Niavon's words were caught in his throat. The problem with the situation was obvious. That contract that had practically given Silas control over them was one thing, but these secrets of their ancestors were another matter entirely. To Silas, these things were one and the same, but they had always treated them like separate matters. Of course, that was only natural. Admitting to having such strong connections with demons was a death sentence in this world. The Thriskai wouldn't need to target them. The system would probably put out trillions of sector-wide QuickTime events. In fact, the system probably wouldn't even have to go that far. It could just turn every power in this galaxy alone against the Golden Grove with a single notification. It was no wonder they were so antsy. However, by the same token, the things inside that world were the treasures of their ancestors as well. It was the one chance they had at returning to the level they had once been at. Silas observed them for a long while before he pulled out something that left them all frozen, including old Brahma. A pristine feather, gorgeous and resplendent in its glow. You recognize this, don't you? Of course they did. They didn't need to guess at it like Silas had to. A Thriskai feather. Put that away, Yao Yao practically screeched. Silas gave her a glance, but he did so almost too slowly. His deliberate and painfully carefree actions left them hyperventilating in a matter of seconds. As far as I'm concerned, you only owe me even more. I'll be taking this feather, and what I got on the inside. I also won't bother to investigate more about just what I saw meant. Quite frankly, I do not care. The only thing I care about is the power in my hands. Work well and I have no reason to discard you. From what I've seen, if your potential is really so great, then it would only be a detriment to me to cut you off. However, if you think that you can control me, intimidate me, pressure me, I'll have you know that I took control of you all once before with a fraction of the power and knowledge I have now. What do you think I can do today? A shocking aura radiated out from Silas, a crown that reflected the arms of an ancient clock appearing behind him in a halo not much unlike Niavon's. All of their hearts stopped beating at once. Old Brahma, Niavon, Yao Yao. The countless other council members still in the surroundings. They all understood what they were seeing at the same time. Dominus Paragon. Silas had actually been the one to take it from the Lever clan. This time, no one stopped him as he left. No one dared. Silas sat in silence in his room. Rather, it was practically like a miniature palace locked away in the depths of the Golden Grove. This was the place given to him by old Brahma and Megian, though he hadn't actually used it much when he had been here as he had focused on spending his time with Andromeda. Now, he had some more time on his hands. One would think that he would spend some of it to enjoy more of the finer things around him, but he had no intention of doing that. In fact, right now his main focus was actually two things. The first, the sprinkling Tao seed. The second, a certain reward from the secret realm, if it could be called that at all. The sprinkling Tao seed was the reward given to Lorien after she defeated Ulrich and Silas. However, ever since Silas had managed to take it from Lorien, he hadn't paid it much mind because of the Thriskai feather. The Thriskai feather was able to accomplish what he wanted with the obelisks, so the sprinkling Tao seed hadn't been needed. Plus, it was honestly kind of hard for Silas to care very much about an item at this level right now. While to the former him, he had been willing to put his life on the line for it, when he put things into perspective, it was a mere treasure compared to what he had. Sprinkling Tao seed, bronze, ether treasure. Imprint your comprehension into this seed and allow it to flourish through the replenishment of ether. Upon reaching a certain level, this Tao seed will sprout into a tree, not only producing and accumulating ether of its own, but also producing branching comprehension paths, offshoots of your own, that can be comprehended to bolster your own. It was a good treasure, all things considered. And in a roundabout way, it could be used to create the ether-rich atmosphere the obelisks had needed to work properly. However, Silas didn't really need it. Or, more accurately, he didn't have the patience or will to divert hard-earned ether toward it. He had been meaning to use it eventually, but when he was thrown into one challenge after another, it was impossible for him to find time to do everything he wanted to do. But now, things were very different. It had risen up to the top of his priority list. Dormant Tao Seed, Ancient Treasure. When Silas left, he had been given the choice of 3 treasures, and he immediately chose this one without hesitation. That was because this Tao Seed radiated an aura that was very familiar to him, one that reminded him of the formation of the Golden Battlefield. If he was correct, it had a Tao of time and space within it. Unfortunately, it was dormant. However, when Silas held the 2 seeds in his palm, the latter suddenly formed an enormous suction force. The sprinkling Tao seed was swallowed whole. Chapter 1263, Tao Sprout. The sparkling Tao seed was a bright gold. It was larger, heavier to the touch, and etched with so many complex runes that it hurt even Silas' eyes to see through them all. It was definitely on the same plane of perfection as genes, a treasure formed naturally by nature rather than one forged by the hand of men. By comparison, the dormant Tao seed was practically like a black hole. It was the darkest shade of black Silas had ever seen, swallowing up all light that even came into its vicinity. In fact, it was so good at it that the light bent near it, making it look almost as though it was coated in a series of concave and convex mirrors. Despite being far smaller than the sparkling Tao seed as well, it swallowed it in a single go. Silas actually wasn't sure if this would work, even after he sensed the suction. But he felt it had a good chance. His reasoning was quite sound. For one, the sparkling Tao seed was a natural treasure, while the dormant Tao seed was forged by someone. Despite the latter clearly being superior, in terms of foundation and material, it was on a level above. That was an odd concept to wrap one's head around, but it fell into Silas' natural intuition, especially when he saw that the sparkling Tao seed had runes that were far more difficult to read, despite the dormant Tao seed technically having runes that had far more foundations. And second, the dormant Tao seed didn't need to be fully reconstructed. It just needed a little nudge to wake up. And this was more than a little nudge. Whoosh. Spacetime Tao seed, ancient treasure. Silas' eyes flashed. This was indeed exactly what he was looking for. The seed looked exactly the same as it had before, but now it was no longer dormant. It had returned to its full-fledged form. After a bit of hesitation, Silas took out the World Shard Jade. This was the jade that held the obelisks. According to the Madness Key, the World Shard Jade was known for being capable of storing exceptionally powerful ether treasures, the kind that normal storage devices cannot withstand the power of, but that was just the most common use. World Shard Jade was capable of holding the spark of a world, carrying it and nurturing it until it births a new world of its own. However, World Shard Jade cannot reach this full potential without first being planted into a worthy vessel. It was no wonder that learning about the World Shard Jade was far more difficult than the obelisks themselves. Silas still remembered racking his brain just to find out that he was learning about the shard itself and not what was inside of it. However, the spacetime Tao seed wasn't a vessel. In fact, it needed a vessel as well. That said, Silas did have a world now. His gaze flickered toward where the hibernation realm was, his thoughts churning. The spacetime Tao seed could theoretically be used like this, but it would be like trying to scan the universe through a peephole. If he could make it sprout first, then studying it would be far easier. He didn't have space for another comprehension. Though he could technically use Taboo Bond to remove a comprehension from himself and replace it with this one, that would depend. He was actually more interested in studying the runes. He had 2 progenitor flame abilities, he didn't need a comprehension to grasp time and space. However, he had a feeling that this would take time. It seems it's time for the Golden Grove to become useful again. Like I said, they do owe me. Silas chose to put away the World Shard Jade for now. He needed it for the obelisk, and he hadn't forgotten that his rewards had directed him toward a place that would likely upgrade those obelisks further. He would need the world shard jade to contain them when the time came. With a thought, Silas threw the spacetime Dao seed into the hibernation realm and then stood. It seemed that he hadn't cleaned out the coffers of the Golden Grove again. 2 days later, Silas stood before a small sprouting tree. He had poured several C-grade ether stones into it, enough to appear on the Golden Grove's record books, but not enough to truly bankrupt them. It was definitely the sort of expense that old Brahma would have put down on Andromeda before he was cut off. Yet, Silas had spent it just to get this spacetime Dao seed. Or rather, tree, to this point. However, it was finally at a point now that there were some runes he could finally study. Right now, it had runes as low as 10 foundations, up to about 80 to 90 or so. It was close to the perfection of the F grade. And that was exactly what Silas wanted. He hadn't expected that soon after he got to study the Golden Battlefield's formation, he would benefit in this way. Silas had learned a lot of concepts from the Golden Battlefield's formation, but if he was honest, he hadn't learned to actually draw anything. They were all E-grade runes, and he hadn't been able to spend as much time as he wanted trying to tweak them to lower the difficulty to F grade. There was a huge jump from the peak of F grade to the lower bounds of E grade. The best of F grade could only be 100 foundations, but the lowest tier of E grade started at 1000. By the time he started making any headway, he had sensed Megan at her limit. If he didn't take action then, she would die, so he had to abandon it. He settled for memorizing the formation and hoping he'd have a better shot at it later. Only to be given this chance instead. This sprout wasn't quite at the perfection of the F grade just yet. But it was getting there. Perfect. This was exactly what Silas wanted. Soon, he would be ready to step into the world of the Beast Warlord Sanctum. Chapter 1264, Instantly. Silas took a seat before the sapling, his eyes focused. There was something about staring at these spacetime runes that made him feel at peace, and yet also made his mind feel as though it was being torn in 2 completely different directions at once. The strokes weren't as simple as any others he had ever seen, as though they weren't written in any rune language he had ever seen before, but also the fact they morphed, changed, and wiggled about as though they didn't really have form or substance. When the time and space runes interacted with one another, it got even worse, as though they were trying to meld into something even more complex, and yet couldn't manage to do it. Like they were meant to be compatible, but weren't in the end. It didn't make any sense. Why would time and space have such a repelling effect on one another? Was it because these runes weren't perfect? On the one hand, this sapling had sprouted from an artificial treasure forged by the hand of man. But on the other hand, it was blooming a very real tree. Unfortunately, the first seemed to take precedent. So will they not function well together unless they are down to 100% mastery? Is that the real reason using chrono and spatial casting is so dangerous? When Silas thought about the first time he used spatial casting to shrink runes, he felt that this might very well be the explanation. Because he had purposely lowered the mastery he drew with at the time, the explosion had rocked him hard. In the end, he was forced to elevate the mastery lest he end up shredding his own soul apart. Is that really the only reason it was so dangerous? If the reason combining time and space was dangerous was only because man couldn't be trusted to draw the runes perfectly enough, then Silas didn't think this was a problem at all. He had yet to draw any one rune to 100% mastery, but also he had never invested so much in a rune to begin with. Right now, his Scorpion Warlord armor could be drawn to 91% mastery. No, that was just the last time he went all out. Silas was quite confident if he focused he could reach 92% now despite how busy he had been all this time. If he had some more focused attention on it, he believed that reaching 95% would be a matter of a few weeks. This wasn't because this was easy, but because Silas had a lot more accumulation now. Since his last personal record, he had evolved his runeweaver profession to E grade, upgraded his eyes, become a member of AD grade race, and arguably most important, had become the dominus paragon of this sector. There was no way his current limit was the same as it had been before. And that was an entire armor. Not just a single rune, but an entire rune mesh system. This was all to say that if Silas really wanted to learn a single rune to 100% mastery, He was confident he could do it. It will still be difficult, though. The strokes of the scorpion are clear and obvious. I could also study the blood essence of a scorpion king before I truly understood them. It's difficult to do the same for spacetime runes unless... Scylla's eyes flashed, realizing he was overthinking things. He didn't need external blood essence to study this time. In this reality, he was the blood essence he needed. That was what his two progenitor flame abilities were here for. They were the bridge he needed between these complicated, hard-to-grasp strokes and himself. Once the language of the strokes became second nature to him, reaching 100% mastery was only a matter of time. In which case, he would start with a spatial rune of 10 foundations. Scylla's eyes immediately locked onto one. It reflected in his mind, its rune separating into 10 foundations, and those foundations separating into 32 strokes. He flipped them in his mind, feeling them and understanding them. The moment he set eyes on this spatial rune, he understood what it could do. It solidified space, making it harder to pass through. If used cleverly, it could interrupt teleportation. If used simply, it became among the most powerful of shields. The spatial element was known to be among the very sharpest ethers, but it was because of the same elements that made it so sharp that it was likewise an excellent shield. At just 10 foundations, it had the defensive properties of a normal earth rune with nearly 50 foundations, and that was only if it was drawn to minimal levels of mastery and if it wasn't stacked. After 7 minutes, Scylla's gaze sharpened and he slowly pressed out a palm. A reflective, silvery black rune was stamped into existence. The space around him shuddered, a ripple that looked almost like a heat wave taking shape as the world warped. Looking through the spatial shield almost felt like gazing right through a twisted mirror. Some things were amplified, other things appeared to be much further away. Scylla flicked out a finger at it and it shattered on impact. But something interesting happened. Even broken, the shield seemed to leach into the mesh of reality, forcing the strength of the attack to spread and disperse. By the time it made it through the shield, the attack was easily half as strong as it had been before. Soul Mastery. On his first attempt, Scylla had drawn it to that level. That was almost as good as drawing another rune to Essence Mastery on the first attempt given the difficulty. Scylla waved it away, allowing the rune to disperse. Rather than focusing on getting it beyond Soul Mastery, Scylla actually moved on to the next. There was one thing he had realized while going over things in Andromeda. The study of runes was like creating a network of your own in your brain, separate from everything else. The more connections you could form, the more information you had, the better conclusions and deductions you could try. If Scylla could learn every rune on this sapling to Soul Mastery first, when he went back to the start, he just might be able to improve to 100% mastery instantly. Chapter 1265, Beneath. So that was what Scylla did. The tree had 777 unique time runes and 777 unique spatial runes. Scylla wasn't sure why the numbers were so exact, or if this was just the exact limit that the sapling had right now. But he committed to learning them all. Many of them overlapped, having the same, or abilities so similar that they almost weren't worth drawing a new rune for, but Scylla didn't discriminate in the slightest. In fact, he sought out ones like that. Runes that had the same function and yet crafted them through vastly different means were the best for establishing his foundation. The concepts from their similarities helped him to learn them faster while also deepening the understanding of the one that came before. He came across countless shield-type space runes. Ones that compressed space into a solid sheet, ones that used distance to force an attack to lose its momentum, ones that used space to divert attacks to other regions, some that used spatial pockets to swallow up large amounts of energy in a single go and have it explode in another dimension. And these were just the distinctly different types. Within them, there seemed to be just as numerous a number of ways to complete the same action. For compression types, you could fold space, or you could make it heavy using a more gravity-like approach, though that seemed to encroach on some aspects of time, or you could bend space to the point that an attack quite literally twisted in on itself, disrupting its runes and shattering it to pieces before it could even reach its attacker in the first place. Once again, these were just defensive types. Amongst the other space runes, there were still those that could be used for attack, those that could be used for movement, and still yet those that could be used on an auxiliary basis. Movement runes that shrank the ground with every step, that brought two unrelated points together, that could even completely convert momentum, allowing one to stop on a dime or transfer all of their speed to the swing of a weapon. Auxiliary runes that could multiply attacks, transfer a blow meant to land in one location to another, or create distortions in space that could disorient one's senses, or even use space to create a clone of oneself. The last one was particularly interesting. It was just that since it was space-related, the number of clones he created would function with an equally divided portion of his strength. Unless he, of course, used some other spatial abilities to compensate for that. The attack runes of space, however, were seemingly where it truly shone. Just the simplest blade could seemingly cut through anything. Even Scylla's constitution was shredded to pieces by a blade formed of a 10 foundation space rune. The way space attacked was simply different from any other ether Scylla's had ever seen. While other ethers ate at defenses before doing internal damage, space split those defenses apart, creating severing lines in reality where they simply didn't exist. Scylla's had read many depictions of space in fiction or seen them in many movies. But it wasn't until it was in his hands that he truly felt the shock of it. Unless one had ether all powerful enough to disrupt his control over the mesh of reality around them, a single spatial blade of this weak rune could kill them. And yet, that was exactly that. A weak rune. There were attacks that could shred a person's body to pieces, compressive attacks that could shrink their bodies into gaps in space that would turn them to mincemeat, dimensional attacks that could swallow their limbs or heads into completely different pieces of the world, or you could even do the opposite of compressing, expanding sections of them until they imploded. And this was all before Scylla's even got to the time runes. The time runes felt no less expansive, and yet their abilities overlapped even more than the space runes did. It felt like there wasn't anything as tangible with the time runes. There was nothing here that could rapidly age a person to the point of death, maybe because these runes were far too weak to do such a thing. Time runes needed to scale first before they could display such power. However, what they could do, even on a limited scale, was no less shocking, especially if matched with chronocasting. Time runes could make attacks echo and multiply even more effectively than space runes could. He could use them to slow people down or speed himself up, crafting minor shifts in temporal perception whether to dilate or shrink. These runes were especially effective on himself, and if he used them in this way, they were even more powerful. He could reverse wounds that weren't caused by ether too powerful for the rune to handle. He could displace himself through time, returning to a location he had been in moments before as a method of teleportation that was far more difficult to detect and stop than normal spatial teleportation. There was even a method here of speeding up his thoughts just enough so he could leap to a deduction he could have made given a few extra seconds. Meaning, he could deduce the future through his own thoughts and perceptions. Although this was even more flawed than a future that could be changed normally, it was a shocking ability nonetheless. The more Scylla's learned, the more runes he brought to soul mastery, some even faintly beyond, the more he realized why affinities for time and space were so rare. Even in this lower threshold, they were powerful enough to be shocking. In the hands of someone who could use them as cleverly and effectively as himself, he felt that calculating an accurate combat matrix index for him would be impossible. What he did know was that the moment he got to the last runes, even before he returned to the beginning to attempt to forge his first 100% mastery runes, he had already surpassed the best F-tier rune master of this generation. He and Furin Lever had yet to meet, but the latter was already beneath his notice. Chapter 1266, Personal Tailor. Scylla stepped out of his room with a calm expression. His robes were no longer torn, but instead oppressed black with golden embroidery. Honestly, he would have preferred to wear the sort of business casual clothing he loved so much back on Earth, but there wasn't exactly a simple way to source that stuff out here. So this would have to do. He didn't make it very far, though, before he was stopped by not just one, but two women. They were both expected by him, but one much more than the other. The less expected of the two was actually Lorien. He had left her here to her own devices, and considering her certain proclivities, though they did have a contract, he assumed that she would be doing her best to stay as far away from him for as long as possible. The second was Megan, the more expected of the two. She stood there in silence, her head lowered, seemingly not in a very chatty mood. From what he knew of her, she was quite a social person, but she hadn't had it in her to stir up a conversation with Lorien, who was a bundle of unexpected nerves right now. Scylla paused, gazed at the two, and, losing patience with the fact neither spoke, he turned to leave. Megan reacted first, snapping out of her trance. She registered the door opening a bit late and rushed forward to stop Silas. Yes, Silas asked calmly. Megan shook her head. I wanted to say thank you. But, is there really no chance that I'd let your grandfather go? No. Megan lowered her head further. She knew how this world worked. If before Silas wasn't willing to, then right now he certainly wouldn't be after he had risked his life to retrieve her. But, if you want to say that I gained from entering your Golden Grove's secret realm, that's true. But this won't change things. He didn't have the time to wait for Megan to wade through her words. It was about time he went off to the Beast Warlord's sanctum, and he had several timelines working in his mind right now. First was Earth's own integration into the wider system. Second was the Milky Way's upgrade as well. Once those two things were completed, they would certainly be in danger. There was also chaosheir and her stint with the petals of the seeing thorn that he had to be wary of, and as though all of that wasn't bad enough, there was still Alex's fuck-up to clean up after. He didn't know when Alex's selfish choice would come to roost, but that made his limited time situation even more pressing. Megan took a breath and looked up to meet Silas's eyes. I understand. Then, how can I repay you? I won't ask you to release my grandfather again, but I only hope that the tasks you give him at least have a good chance of survival. A pawn that dies too early or too easily would be a wasted pawn. Megan clenched her teeth, not liking the way Silas spoke of her grandfather, but she still understood it to be true. At the very least, underneath the detached chill, Silas was saying that he wouldn't easily go and get the one C-tier he could fully control killed just because. She lowered her head again. There's someone soon to join the petals of the seeing thorn, or rather already has. My wife, chaosheir Grimblade. You'll go and support her. Silas looked up to Lorien. As will you. After Silas said this, he directly left. Lorien's mouth opened as though she wanted to say something, but her words were inevitably caught in her throat. Sighing, she shook her head. Maybe this was another opportunity too. Given the situation Silas had thrown the Milky Way into, the Thriskai no longer had the care to suppress her mist clan. They were bottom feeders to begin with. Ulrich was dead, his father was dead, and the main clan never cared about such minor characters. It could be said that all the planning Lorien had done was absolutely worthless, and yet she had gained so much more even while Silas wasn't paying much attention to her at all. If she wanted to reach a new level, this was going to have to be the way. Shutting up and following him would be enough for now. Asterisk. For the first time, Silas stepped outside of the Golden Grove's headquarters. Looking up to the skies, he ran a hand through his hair. As wild and unruly as it looked, it was quite soft to the touch and didn't tangle or knot in the slightest. Hygiene had always been important to Silas, and while he didn't get much of a chance to focus on it running around these days, when he did get such a chance, he went all out. With a thought, he brought Jalla and Alex out, shaking his head at the unfortunate disappearance of the demonic emperors. Unfortunately, he wouldn't have them in his repertoire. Not far behind him, old Brahma stood, his gaze respectful and his hands clasped behind his back. With him here, Silas could at least make certain that he wouldn't die due to the random temper of some arrogant bastard. The journey to the Beast Warlord's sanctum wasn't too easy and straightforward. Well, making it to the galaxy would be easy. Unfortunately, once there was no direct teleportation to their sanctum. They were a holy land of sorts that could only be accessed by those given a badge of entry. Silas had Grelith's token of identity, but it wasn't the badge he needed. He would have to show it at the gates, and that would mean actually getting there first. You sure you want to wear that? Alex asked, blinking with a grin on his face. Silas looked over with a flicker in his eyes. Do you have a suggestion? I never told you, I'm a bit of a fashionista myself, a man's man, and a woman's ideal lover. I have a tailoring profession. Is that so? Silas nodded. I won't wear anything with defensive or attacking buffs. Alex's grin widened. Leave it to me. Soon, Silas stood feeling a lot more comfortable. Who said he had to conform to everything in this world? He had been running around one step shy of an ape for too long. Rather than adapting to this world, it would be better if at least in some aspects, it adapted to him. He wore a long, sleek black trench coat, pairing it with some black slacks and a button-up crimson-red dress shirt, its collars swaying slightly in the wind. A pair of black boots adorned his feet, and for the first time in a long while, he felt comfort in what he was wearing. He exhaled a calm breath, slipping on a pair of black sunglasses that hid the depths of his emerald eyes. Now, he felt ready. "Suck up," Jala muttered. "Rather than insulting me, you should be asking me why I can read his mind. I'd make a good wife, wouldn't I?" Jala's face twisted with disgust. "What's with that face? There's probably someone fucking a tentacle monster around the corner right now, and this is what's throwing you off. Get it together." Silas strolled off to the nearest teleportation platform, ignoring their banter. His eyes had a depth of dark focus to them barely hidden behind shade. Chapter 1267, Forward. Hands in his pockets, Silas took a step out of a teleportation portal. Jala and Alex weren't far behind, but the sickness on their faces couldn't be hidden. It seemed that they still hadn't gotten used to long-distance teleportation at all. Not far behind them was old Brahma, still as silent and respectful as ever. One wouldn't expect that this sort of man would be capable of such a quiet side at all. It made him harder to read, but Silas didn't mind it. "This is Planet Vorten. It's on the outer reaches of the Beast Warlord Sanctum's territory," old Brahma introduced. Silas nodded slowly. In truth, he had already memorized all the star maps of this sector that he could. The problem was that for galaxy-owned territories like this one, maps were too precious to just allow to appear anywhere. For a power as strong as the Beast Warlord Sanctum, the only way to get maps of their star systems was to get them through an underhanded means, like through the petals of the Seeing Thorn, for example. Of course, any organization worth their salt would hunt down anyone casually passing around star maps of their territory. It was too much of a strategic advantage for an enemy's attack. In a world as wide in scope as this one, a large part of the so-called home field advantage was knowing your stars better than anyone else did, as well as being able to move around them as you pleased. Unfortunately, that left Silas in a bit of a situation. This was the only location that he could conveniently teleport to. The rest of the way had to be taken by starship manned by trusted parties of the Beast Warlord Sanctum. These starships also wouldn't be taking any of the prime hyper-highways, so it might very well take months to reach his destination. The odds that there wouldn't be any danger along the way were next to zero as well. With the financial backing of the Golden Grove, it isn't impossible to make it to the Beast Warlord Sanctum in about a month or so. But I'm not sure if that would be the smartest decision to make, old Brahma finished. "And why's that?" Silas asked. "Money attracts attention. I don't know much about the Beast Warlord galaxy, but what I do know has never been good. The population of beasts to humanoids in this galaxy is very skewed, and those humanoids that do make the choice to frequent this galaxy often have ulterior motives. It's in the best interest of the Beast Warlord Sanctum, due to the unique paths, that the concentration of wild territories is quite high, but that leaves large swaths of the galaxies unmanned and unpatrolled. Nature itself becomes their personal guard in most cases, that and various outposts and dangerous stations they usually end up using as training grounds for the disciples. But there are a lot of pirates that slip through the cracks, taking advantage of the chaos. There are at least 3 renowned pirate groups here that have C-tiers amongst their highest echelon, and those C-tiers are most likely to appear to target the sort of starships that could get you there in a month's time." Silas listened without interrupting, taking a look around the city before him. For one of the prime choice destinations for anyone wanting to make it to the Beast Warlord Sanctum. It was certainly quite bland, but old Brahma's explanations made it more obvious as to why. People didn't really frequent this place at all. The Beast Warlord Sanctum wasn't a vacation destination. It was half akin to being thrown back to primitive times. The roads were only somewhat paved, stony paths chipped by age and worn by hooves leading out into the town of stores and homes that looked to be little better than thatched huts. Though, the architecture was still quite interesting, even a bit beautiful in a bestial sort of way. But maybe that was the sort of ambience one could expect here at the core of Beast Warlord Sanctum territory. "We'll take the shortest path," Silas said calmly. After all, wasn't that why he had brought the likes of old Brahma in the first place? He didn't have the time to waste. Plus, it wasn't a foolish decision. If those speedy paths existed, presumably the ones manning them would be quite used to it as well. They would be prepared for attacks. With old Brammer, Silas was more confident in protecting himself and dealing with the situation. Pirates aren't exactly the only problem, old Brammer continued as though unbothered. It seemed he had already expected Silas' decision. Silas nodded, beginning to walk into the town. Those that take the shortest path are most likely those that both come from strong backgrounds and are likewise aiming for the Beast Warlord's sanctum. I don't really pay attention to the cycles much, but if it happens to be near to a recruitment cycle, even if it won't be in a month's time exactly, I've heard that those aiming to enter the Beast Warlord's sanctum will come early and spend the approaching months steeped in the territory's ambience to acclimate themselves to the beast path they want to take. And that's trouble because, Silas asked, if your identity is uncovered, the strongest of them will want to fight you. No, rather, they'd want to kill you to replace you. Is that so? Silas replied absent-mindedly, his trench coat waving in the wind. Slowly, his steps came to a stop as he looked ahead to a massive fleet of starships. They didn't need to travel far at all to reach the docking station, but it was quite the sight to behold nonetheless. It didn't take a genius to know that starships weren't like normal cargo ships. Rather than an expanse of sea, the starships were docked in large basins of what looked like stainless steel but was certainly not. It was most definitely the most futuristic-looking place they had been to. Silas took out a familiar badge and spun it on his finger, the light of the sun bouncing off the reflective violet gold. I look forward to it. He didn't plan to hide his identity. In fact, he had every intention of letting them know right here and now. Chapter 1268, Number. Silas caught his badge, his telekinesis and Etherborn were working together to form a thread of green that hung the badge from one of his belt loops. Old Brammer's lip finally twitched. With the same stride, Silas turned to the side, walking down the lane and ignoring the streams of people of various races moving in and out. Most wouldn't recognize the badge, and that didn't bother him in the slightest. One might think that it was the true pride seed talking, and maybe that was it in part. But Silas' vision was out further than that. From what he understood about the disciple acceptance ceremony, there was a part of the category that was quite arbitrary and based on feel. The matter of reputation and the so-called face of the Beast Warlord sanctum was factored in. This was an odd tradition if you asked Silas. After all, this was something that Grelith had decided on personally. It seemed weird that the Beast Warlord sanctum had a say in who one of their most powerful members took as a disciple and who they didn't. But that wasn't something for Silas to decide. Right about now, he didn't have much of a reputation, and revealing himself as Dominus Paragon would be a bit silly for the time being. Whoever he had taken it from was in all likelihood looking for it like a madman right now, and it would restrict his actions too much to end up in such a quagmire. That wasn't something old Brammer could protect him from. In all likelihood, that person and their backing were impossibly far beyond Brammer's own. In that case, Silas would have to build up his reputation on his own before he went to clear the remaining tests of the sanctum. There was another reason he was doing this as well. Well, two reasons. The first was that he wanted to see just how he stacked up. Too many people were wearing stat-protecting treasures, so much so that it seemed like a common accessory here. And unlike what he had been able to do in the Milky Way, he couldn't just shatter these treasures either. The good news was that his will had gotten very good at feeling out how powerful people were without being able to read their stats. But that could only take him so far. He wanted a better feel, a recalibration of sorts so that his senses would be even more accurate. The second reason he wanted to do this was to test out his new abilities. He could speculate all he wanted, but until he saw these runes in action, it would all be meaningless. Is this the best starship they have? Silas asked old Brammer. Right now, they were staring at an empty basin of silver. It was the largest of them all, but the starship that had been docked here had yet to return. Around, there were quite a number of people waiting, but they mostly seemed to be handlers. There was a man with digitigrade legs and tall antlers to one side. He seemed quite imposing, but that facade completely shattered when an amulet around his neck twinkled. Yes, young master. No, young master, it is still not here. I will be sure to call to inform you when it is. Yes, young master, of course. Conversations like this one were abound, and most only looked over to pay attention when old Brammer appeared in the picture. It was impossible for them not to pay attention to a C tier that had suddenly appeared. Old Brammer's aura was quite reserved, but they knew a powerhouse when they saw one. From Scylla's senses, all of these handlers were D tier, with the exception of just two. One of the C tiers was the antlered man with a beard that was decidedly goat-like. The other was an old woman that looked to have a foot in the grave already. But it was hard to tell if those were her wrinkles, or if they were a series of complex, layered scales. The old woman and the antlered man were the first to react to Old Brammer's appearance, causing the others to pay more attention as well. Yes, young master, there is another one that has appeared, yes. No, I do not recognize who he follows, but he seems to be from the Golden Grove. He has the aura of a Unatower. Yes, it is indeed unexpected. The eyes of the antlered man scanned Jalla, Alex, and Scylla's as though trying to ascertain something. But when he saw the badge hanging from Scylla's hip, his eyes opened wide. Nearly stumbling a step back, the man barely caught himself, his hoof shaking the ground a bit too vigorously. For a moment, many thought the starship they had been looking for had finally come, but that wasn't the case at all. Instead, it was just the careless step of a C tier. Indeed, it was quite a powerful tier. And unlike with the D tier, Scylla's had no ability to ignore their oppression. The old woman noticed the change immediately and started scanning for the reason when she too saw it. While the various other citizens and pedestrians they had passed had no idea what they were looking at, it was clear that these two C tiers were not the same at all. The old, wrinkly scaled woman immediately pulled out a communication device. "Are you sure you don't want me to stop them?" Old Brammer asked. Scylla's looked over and confirmed something in his thoughts. Old Brammer was definitely not a normal C tier. In fact, a good portion of the C tiers in this sector were beneath his notice. But this wasn't a surprise to Scylla's. He could already guess this by the sort of power he held in the Golden Grove. Rather than saying the council had suppressed Old Brammer, it was more accurate to say he had allowed him to so that the merchant guild wasn't shredded to pieces. "No, it doesn't matter," Scylla's said indifferently. His gaze had already turned up to the skies. He felt a shift in the gravity of the planet that was none too subtle. It was coming. A starship. And quite a large one at that. One certainly large enough to fill this steely basin. Chapter 1269, Maintenance. The planet rumbled and shook before stabilizing. It was quite curious to Scylla's. The size of the ship was enormous, but it definitely wasn't big enough to cause such a disturbance if it could be parked on the planet itself, especially since, while this was a mostly barren and forgotten world, it certainly wasn't a weak one. There were only two explanations that Scylla's could think of. Either the ship was incredibly dense, or there's something particularly interesting about its runes. If a starship wasn't going to be using hyperhighways, but could still make it across a galaxy in about a month's time, there had to be something special about it. Clearly, that had to be in its runes. A combination of both. Fascinating. Scylla's had been in this world for a while now, but it was the first time he was actually interacting with it in a real, meaningful sense. Usually, he was on a strict timeline or trying to save his life in some way or another. Though that was still true in a macro sense right now, he felt far more relaxed than he had at any point in the last year. That allowed him to smell the roses, so to speak. Old Brammer had offered to teach him his path, but honestly Scylla's hadn't been all that interested. The Mech Rune Master path seemed only useful for the one mode that Scylla's couldn't use it for. Well, at least that was how Old Brammer used it the most. If Scylla's tried to use a mech in battle, the scorned raps would burn it to ash. However, what of vessels like this or the Unforged like Andromeda? It was a path that had its own potential. "What do you think?" Scylla's asked, turning to Old Brammer. The old man seemed confused for a moment before he realized that Scylla's was talking about the descending ship. "Oh, it's a starship forged from dwarf iron, forged from the core of dwarf stars. It's incredibly dense, so though it's not very large, that ship is probably heavier than the entire planet. It takes advantage of that density to propel itself through the world, but that makes docking it particularly tricky. It not only requires an expert's touch, but if you're not careful you could destroy a world on launch." Scylla's continued to look up and observe. The series of handlers were all notifying their geniuses. Also, judging by the number of babysitters here, it is indeed near a recruitment cycle. Scylla's nodded somewhat indifferently, far more interested in the ship above him. In case you're interested, the antlered people are known as the Servidans. They're AD grade race and are quite well known for their strong ether manipulation and mental abilities. They create some pretty strong rune masters in general, and once in a blue moon they might birth a C-grade version of their race based on a unique mutation trait they have related to their antlers. The others are the Skarsik. They're known less for their rune mastery and more for their heavy bones and oppressive strength. But they too can undergo random mutation that gives their signature defenses to their minds and wills as well, giving them the best of both worlds. If they're here, I would assume that their tag-alongs have these mutations. Hey, old man, Alex cleared his throat. I don't think he's listening. Old Brahma ignored Alex, and Jala seemed to get a kick out of that. It was just unfortunate that Alex probably didn't even know how to spell shame, let alone feel it. Mutations. Silas mumbled out the word several minutes later, looking over to old Brahma with narrowed eyes. That could happen to races. Random mutations that allowed them to be a step beyond their ancestors. Interesting. Boom, boom, boom. The starship slowly touched down, a quaking might spreading in all directions as the entire planet rumbled. Not long later, the hull opened up and a beautifully polished, almost pill-shaped vessel cracked open like an egg. A figure stepped out with a chest as hairy as its own personal forest. This wasn't just a method of illustrating the thickness, but also a reflection of its color, a mossy green that rippled in the wind. The man had skin tanned to a dark brown and eyes as black as night, without the slightest hint of sclera. The bestial aura he radiated was oppressive, and he too was certainly in the C tier. It was just that, with the bloodlust he was radiating, he had almost certainly had to use that bestial aura not long ago. A big cat. These were the only 3 words Silas thought to himself when seeing this man. Despite his appearance, Silas was certain that this man followed the path of a big cat. He didn't know all the divided paths of the Beast Warlord Sanctum or if there was even a limit to them. But he could pick out an aura when he sensed one. The man had been about to speak when he sensed something pass over him. His gaze flickered, feeling like someone was scanning him in a way that was very unfamiliar. His eyes narrowed and soon they landed on Silas. Scorpion, serpent. Confusion colored the man's face for a moment until he saw the badge. His pupils constricted into pinholes and a rumbling might came out of him for a moment that suffocated almost all those around but old Brahma himself. However, the man quickly restrained himself, especially as several auras flashed over from a distance. There was no doubt that it was those geniuses that had been called forward by their handlers. Silas met the man's eyes calmly and without a single word. After another flicker, the man looked away. The ship will undergo 3 hours of maintenance and restocking before launching again. Payment will only be taken in the form of C-grade etherstones. No negotiating. Payment will be by the head. Bang, bang. 2 more echoing bangs, a Skarsik and a Servidan landed heavily on the ground, the gazers scanning the crowd like a pair of rabid animals. Chapter 1270, Why Didn't You Tell Me? Silas' back was faced to the new arrivals, his hands resting in his pockets. The blasting winds, still churning from the descent of the enormous starship, shifted his hair and trench coat in the wind, the heft of the former seemingly not stopping its dancing in the air. Even now, he was still mostly focused on the starship, the Skarsik and Servidan a distant thought in the back of his mind. But as he slowly grasped what he wanted to from the starship, he regained his focus, feeling the 2 wheels practically firmly locked onto his back. There was a flicker in Silas' eyes, and both shattered instantly. The Skarsik and Servidan both felt their minds warp for a moment, but they shook their heads, reacting much more favorably to a repulsion of their wills than Silas had ever seen before. Given the fact they were both in the F tier, this made Silas all the more curious. Indeed, this was a new league. Any other F tier he had faced until now might have coughed up blood on the spot. These 2, though, barely seemed to have hints of discomfort. But it was very curious. Why were they so confident in trying to scan my stats? From what Silas had seen, basically everyone wore protection treasures. Those here who could be followed by D and C tier handlers would almost certainly be wearing high-caliber protection treasures at that. So, logically speaking, the first instinct of these 2 shouldn't have been to try and scan his stats like they had just done. Especially since, in their eyes, he was on similar standing. Interesting. Was it a probe instead? Is there some sort of unspoken rule amongst these so-called young masters and mistresses where they spar with their wills first? Silas thought of all of this before he turned back to face them. The Skarsik was a woman. Standing at almost 8 feet tall, she loomed even over Silas. There were a twin pair of scythes that crisscrossed on her back in menacing, jagged arcs, while the leathery tone of her skin beneath her jawline was all the more obvious than the wrinkled old woman. There was a touch of grayed green to the skin, and when the sunlight hit it in just the right ways, it almost looked more like the scales of a lizard than a thick hide. Silas didn't try to see their stats because he knew he would be rebuffed, but he could tell that her constitution must be absolutely off the charts. The woman was oddly beautiful in an exotic sort of way. She had the delicate and soft features one would expect from the fairer sex despite her behemoth of a size. But the leather straps, thick hide armor, and boots that seemed to add another 6 inches to her already ridiculous height didn't help. And then there was the Servadin. He looked almost delicate. His face was among the most handsome Silas had ever seen, his antlers arcing boldly and proudly in polished white. He didn't seem to have a weapon on obvious display, but Silas' suppressed mixed demonic art was sensing the strands of a strong, thin sword, one focused on swiftness and agility. Both were looking towards Silas with expressions that couldn't have been more serious if they tried, almost as though they were facing off against the enemy of a lifetime. It was clear they understood all too well what that badge represented. However, what was throwing them off was that Silas was human. Humans, regardless of the kind, were too rare in the Beast Warlord Sanctum. In the sector, there were no known powerful human clans, and those that were somewhat decent in power had no beast bloodlines in them. To become a powerful beast warlord, you almost certainly had to have a strong connection to a beast at some point. It was said that trying to comprehend a warlord rune armor was otherwise impossible. There were a rare few that were capable of making it far just based on their raw rune master talent alone, but those existences were all on the Combat Matrix Index or the Rune Master leaderboard. If Silas had been on either, they would certainly recognize him instantly. Of course, not all of those on those leaderboards would have their faces blasted everywhere. But what was certain was that their wills would be. That was to say that any one of them could be recognized by the will radiated from their etched names. They had felt Silas' will just now. Deep, unfathomably so, so much so they had a hard time believing it came from an F tier in the first place. But it wasn't recognized by either one of them. A brief glance between the two was able to confirm that. "May I ask for your name?" The Servadin, Sporide Holieng, spoke slowly, his tone firm, but his voice almost gentle. Silas looked at him for a moment before his lips parted. Silas Grimblade. Sporide felt his heart skip a beat, and Silas noticed it immediately, his wheels internally churning. No one should know his name, so why would Sporide react like that? Before he could understand it, old Brahma grabbed his shoulder and suddenly vanished. Bang! Just where Silas had been standing, a javelin as thick as a pillar vanished. There was still a calmness in Silas' eyes as he felt the world shifting around him, maybe a little too fast. He thought about what could have happened just now, and who would have attacked him. That was certainly not an attack from an F tier, otherwise he doubted it could hide from him at all. Alex and Jalla was sent flying by the reverberating impact, coughing up blood and cursing. "God damn it," Alex cursed. "The one time was supposed to get special treatment and this bullshit happens." Silas had just come to a proper conclusion when old Brahma hissed in his ears. "Why didn't you tell me that you established a royal line? Don't you know how dangerous this is?" Chapter 1271, 2 minutes. Silas' answer was obviously no. But he didn't think that just saying his name would elicit the change. He certainly didn't feel it, which was odd considering the sensitivity of his senses. That meant that whatever results saying his name triggered, it must have happened inside the body of whoever heard it, almost like a suppression of sorts. It was odd, though. Silas had had his royal line for quite a while, ever since he claimed the woodland territory. Right now he didn't have a royal line, he had a royal hero line. It was on a completely different level. But that didn't explain why they would attack him. No, more accurately, why a C tier would suddenly go out of their way to attack him like this even at the risk of offending Grelith and old Brahma. It was one thing if Silas' peers killed him, that was perfectly allowed and wouldn't be pursued. The Beast Warlord Sanctum had many years of precedent for this, and everyone felt safe to do exactly that. That was even more so for Grelith, who was practically known as a pacifist. Or, it was more accurate to say that this was the case for the entire Scorpion line. Those that could tap into the Scorpion lineage tended to be patient and risk-averse. This wasn't how Silas saw the Scorpion lineage, but he was also the one that pointed out Earth escape shouldn't be part of the armor's arsenal. His views were very different than the other Scorpions. However, if it was a C tier, or even an E tier, that acted to try and take out Silas under less than savory circumstances, well, there would be consequences for that. The question was how bad would they be? Since Silas wasn't an official disciple just yet, the punishment, in all likelihood, wouldn't be death. So whether it was worth it would be entirely dependent on whether what they gained out of killing Silas was worthwhile. Grelith's badge. No, that wasn't worth it. All of these young masters and mistresses here knew that that badge, when in the hands of anyone but Silas, was just an opportunity to prove themselves. Most who got their hands on it wouldn't even chase after the best benefit you could get, that being becoming Grelith's replacement disciple. Instead, most would trade it in to become a normal high-class disciple of the Sanctum and not risk it. After all, if they were in Silas' position but lacked the talent Grelith saw in him, they would just end up dying too. No one was foolish enough to think Grelith blind and incapable of seeing whether Silas had potential or not. The question was if Silas had tapped into enough of that potential that he could protect himself. Usually, new disciples were more vulnerable than established ones and also tended to come from families that weren't too established either. The Skarzik and the Servadan were two excellent examples. They were bringing forward a pair of mutated geniuses from this generation. But if they could produce beings of this caliber with every birth, they would just hoard their geniuses themselves and rise up to become the next superpower. That was why Silas was being targeted. They knew he had potential, but potential wasn't real strength. Not yet. That was to say that a C tier wouldn't do this just for the badge. That meant they want to take advantage of my royal hero line. But how can they know so confidently that they can take it away? It was like the will search by the two young geniuses again. They had used their will when they shouldn't, and now Silas was being targeted when the obvious assumption should be that he had gene locks to protect his bloodline. Why were they so sure that they could get something from his corpse? Was it more obvious than he thought that he was from a backwater place? For the aura of a royal line to leak so easily, you definitely don't have a gene lock on it. Plus, the senses of C tiers are far more sensitive, and didn't I tell you that the Servadans are known for their mental abilities? Old Brahma's words continued to pierce into Silas' mind on a line. How many are looking to attack? Silas asked calmly. Just the Servadan has attacked until now. Can you have him? With ease. Then put me down. Others might pick up on it too. Maybe, but if you can handle one with ease, you can handle two. Who said that there'd just be two? These stragglers might dare to attack me, but the C tiers on the starship won't dare. At least not out in the open. Their standing in this situation is much different because they're vassals of the Sanctum. Old Brahma paused for a moment and then flickered again, putting Silas down. Silas could finally see clearly around him, and high in the skies there were already pockets of carnage. The clouds looked like they had had holes hundreds of kilometers wide blown in them, triggered by nothing more than a descending attack. Then Silas saw him, the handler that had been speaking to Sporide so respectfully through a communication device barely more than a few minutes ago. Kill him, Silas said. Are you sure? Silas didn't reply directly, his gaze calm as he shifted down towards Sporide. I just want to stretch my legs a bit. Old Brahma's eyes flickered. Silas was someone that had managed to clear an impossible E-tier secret realm he had been certain would be impossible for anyone else. It felt almost a bit silly to be worried about a battle against F-tiers. But old Brahma also knew the state of deterioration that Secret Realm was in. If not for an odd glitch, it wouldn't have become as impossible as it was. It seemed, though, that he'd finally see an inkling of what made Silas so special. Alright, will you be alright with 2 minutes? Old Brahma asked. Is that implying you could do it faster? Yes. 2 minutes is fine. I'll finish in less, though, Silas replied. Old Brahma vanished. So did Silas. Chapter 1272. Chi. Silas only took a step forward, but the distance he crossed was leagues beyond that. With old Brahma's speed, He had already taken Silas over a kilometer away from the scene, and that was after backtracking due to Silas' opposition. But whatever distance there had been, Silas closed it with nothing more than a step, the space around him seemingly shrinking on command. Runes began to flicker to life around him, rotating with an emerald hue that imbued them with his will, stamping them into existence. "Step out," Silas said calmly. Sporide was still amongst the others, not having stepped out yet. But when he saw Silas suddenly appear, he froze for a moment. When he heard the words, his pride seemed to flare up. With a flicker, a flexible, thin sword appeared in his palm. Bang! He shot forward, his speed blinding. It was a simple, straightforward attack, but it was also the sort that was almost impossible to find a flaw in. Perfect in its simplicity, almost regal in its sharpness. There was a royal, but delicate air to it, an attack that was infused with Sporide's own unique will. This was the first time Silas was fighting someone who could stand amongst the wider sector. Although a certain Thriskai young genius had come to the Milky Way, he had been suppressed as an outsider. Sporide, though, was not. He boldly displayed his strength, displaying unique strengths and techniques. As simple as the strike looked, Silas could feel the shifts and changes, the years of training, the millennia of ancestry that went into refining those training methods, and the blood and sweat that had forged it all. Silas had always known that he wasn't using his will optimally, but a single strike from Sporide made it all the more obvious. Unfortunately, Ch. All of Sporide's momentum seemed to be instantly eaten up. His sword stopped a single inch from Silas' nose as though it had burnt out. Sporide blinked in surprise, not understanding what was happening at all. And then the realization hit him, his eyes opening wide. Ch. Danger hit Sporide's senses like a swinging sledgehammer. He hurried to accelerate backward, dipping to one side, and then another. His hooves tapped along the ground in an elegant cadence that left rippling ether on the ground as though disturbing the surface of a calm lake. He drew his blade in a circle, his hair standing on end all the while. He realized in that instant that Silas was a space rune master. Those existences were not only rare, but also incredibly difficult to deal with. What made Silas even more extraordinary was that he was casting far too fast. One spatial blade after another took shape, almost invisible in the way they formed. Silas wasn't just creating them, he was forming them from blind spots, using Sporide's own ether as cover, and often even just using the rays of the sun to hide them in plain sight. It was a shocking amount of control, and it instantly put Sporide on his back foot for what looked like a minimal amount of effort. Even now, several exchanges into the battle, Silas was just standing there, his hands in his pockets, his trench coat billowing in the wind. The only thing that seemed to suggest he was fighting at all was the fiery glow of green in his eyes. Ch. Sporide suddenly came to a stop. The region had already been cleared out. Between the battle between the sea tiers high above and that surging might coming from Silas and Sporide, no one wanted to be close anymore. But they certainly didn't want it now. A green aura came from Sporide as well, but this one was far more natural, almost like he was communicating with nature itself. Greenery began to bloom, but it didn't seem to form an attack. Instead, Silas could almost feel the latter's senses becoming sharper, stronger, harder to fool, as though the world itself was opening up to him. He weaved his will into the world not to suppress it, but to become one with it. And right then, the spatial blades that had seemed so impossible to detect before became as clear as day, reflecting like silvery glass in his eyes. Sporide's pupils darted around, back and forth, as he tracked them all, feeling out changes for new runes taking shape as well. It seemed that this was his own unique rune master-related unique gene. A powerful one at that. Bang! Activating a movement skill, Sporide's pace accelerated beyond normal means. In that brief instant, Silas was sure his speed actually touched 7 figures and then went beyond, blurring as he closed in the distance. Interesting. Silas still didn't move. Unfortunately for Sporide, he was no normal rune master. The shades of green forming threads in Silas' irises began to dance as his weaving irises suddenly pulsed to life. All of a sudden, the spatial blades in the surroundings froze and flashed. They teleported, space distorting around them as naturally as breathing until they fused into a single being, a rune with over 40 foundations layering into a mesh of several of a kind. Bang! Sporide slammed right into the concentrated wall of space as though a bird slamming into clear glass. As funny as the visual might have been, the devastation was no less near lethal. His bones shattered, his face was pancaked, his body feeling as though he had run full speed into his own demise. Scylla's weaving irises pulsed again and the concentrated wall changed shape, becoming a teleportation rune that sent Sporide high into the skies. He was so disoriented that he didn't even have the wherewithal to use his will to resist the teleportation, and by the time he realized his folly, it was too late. Bang! Sporide shattered to pieces, a rain of his blood and gore falling like a rain from above that didn't so much as touch Scylla's clothes, the bits and pieces that would have been reflected by an invisible barrier. As for how he died, a residual strike from the power of his own handler. Scylla's didn't even bloody his own hands. On the starship, the man of the big cat path watched Scylla's with flames practically spewing from his eyes. Chapter 1273, Granny. Scylla's finally took a hand out of his pocket, a pulse of might coming from him. All of a sudden, there was a large surge of blood essence that came from the remains of the Servadon's body, pooling together until it was crafted into a perfect ball in Scylla's palm. He looked at it, his eyes flickering. Gene locks were commonplace, but what Scylla's had noticed was that it layers deeper than gene talents, the same mechanisms that kept most under lock and key were not. The trouble was that the methods for collecting blood essence were even rarer, and the methods for taking advantage of said blood essence just as rare, if not more so. The odds of someone both having a method of collecting blood essence and having the exact method you needed to utilize the particular blood essence in question was next to zero. Scylla's himself had once had his hands on such a method. It was just that that body refinement method was already useless to him. He was a D-grade human semioid now. There was nothing he had gotten from a mere branch of a golden grove in a backwater corner of the world that could possibly be helpful to him. Logically, Scylla's certainly didn't have the unique blood essence utilization method he would need for the Servadon's family line. But he didn't need it, nor did he want it. He was simply using it to observe the runes. They reflected in his eyes in a wondrous layer of mystery, and siphoning through it all, he soon found exactly what he was looking for. Deep inside, there was a small kernel of something, a will that was capable of changing its resonance to fit that of the world. Scylla's hand splayed outward and the rest of the blood essence shattered. From an outsider's perspective, it almost looked like he was just desecrating Sporide's corpse even more than he already had. But from his, he had picked out exactly what he was looking for, seamlessly placing it within the madness key. Studying genes was already hard. Studying blood essence was bound to be levels beyond. The more Scylla's thought about it, the more he felt that Grelith couldn't have been more correct. How could there be so many things in the world that even he, as a RuneSpark master, struggled so much with? Sporide was an F-tier existence. His genes, gene talents, down to his blood essence and beyond, were all built with F-tier runes. There would be some exceptions, but this was true for the most part. Logically, Scylla should be able to see through such things with a glance. But he couldn't. The world of runes was so much more vast than he had had the chance to comprehend. It almost made him want to stay in the F-tier for as long as he could. But he knew that he couldn't do that. Once he established himself in the Beast Warlord's sanctum, he would follow the map he had received and hopefully find a method to progress to a C-grade race, or maybe even B, if he was lucky. He'd take advantage of that time to hopefully increase the grade of his F-grade foundation as well. Then he would progress to the E grade. If there was one thing his experience on Earth had taught him, it was that as much as he wanted his foundation to be absolutely perfect, life often had different thoughts in mind. And considering he had suddenly become someone that even C-tiers wouldn't hesitate to attack in broad daylight, he would have no choice but to get stronger, and much faster at that. Soon, he'd be hunted down for far more than just his royal line. His gaze shifted toward the Skarsik. She and her handler stood there, the only pair that was still somewhat close to the carnage. Scylla's could feel them hesitating, wondering if they should take action. But the C-tier's eyes were focused enough on old Brahma that her expression was all too readable. She wasn't hesitating due to Scylla's. She was hesitating due to the old man. Scylla's couldn't follow the battle above at all. Or, rather, he didn't want to waste the will and stamina it would take him to, especially since his luck wasn't blaring warnings at him. That was to say that from the old woman's expression alone, he knew that the real reason she wasn't attacking was because she knew her life would be forfeit the moment she did. Old Brahma was too powerful. It seemed that Silas had gotten his hands on quite a good helper, indeed. Suddenly, he walked forward. The C-tier old woman noticed instantly, frowning. Her gaze was still locked up above, but Silas could feel her pressure washing over him. It was subtle enough to make it clear it wasn't a threat, but also oppressive enough that most F-tiers would have already collapsed. Silas kept walking, though, until he was barely 3 or so meters from the pair. And then he stopped. When he comes back down here, I will ask him to kill you. So, you have 2 options. First, you leave now. Second, you attack me while you have the chance. Silas had returned his hand to his pockets, staring ahead at the C-tier and the F-tier young mistress that followed after her. The C-tier finally looked at Silas directly, her gaze flickering. Why was this young man so confident? She knew why instantly. Old Brahma could have finished the battle above a long while ago, she could feel it. But he was reserving his strength and keeping cards on hand. He had given the 2-minute timer for that exact reason and didn't plan to take a single second less if he didn't have to. If the F-tier Skarsik, a giantess of a woman, pulled out her 2 sides, wielding one in each hand. Silas looked at her curiously. An interesting choice, to be sure. Granny Tim, I will handle him. Chapter 1274, Rhino. Tyria was a woman of few words, and seemingly not much a fan of conversation, because as soon as she spoke, she had already taken a step forward. The slicing winds and howling cyclones formed from the unsheathing of her sides cut across the air, whipping about in almost loose strands of chaos that lashed against their clothing and hair. The shocking part. It was all physical strength. Silas couldn't sense any sort of wind ether coming from her at all. But this wasn't what truly baffled him. The question still remained the same. Why was she so confident? And then came the flicker. A silvery grey armor took shape. It was just a helm, one that formed over her delicate features and protruded out with the powerful horn of a rhino. At that moment, something that had been kept suppressed spilled out in waves, and Silas finally grasped it. Rhino Warlord armor. I see. Surprisingly, it seemed that he wasn't the only one here on a trek toward becoming an official disciple. There was another. That meant that, in all likelihood, she wasn't just far superior in strength to Spride, but the same soft power protections that Silas had, she too had. It might be worth it for her C-tier to kill Silas because of his unprotected royal line. But the same wouldn't be the case for old Brahma, especially since many had likely started connecting the dots by now. Old Brahma didn't use many of the tactics usual Unitowers did. He didn't use a bow and arrow, he wasn't in his true form, and he wasn't radiating the same usual golden aura. But everyone here was especially sensitive to beast auras, especially the Servadan. That meant that they knew of his connection to the Golden Grove, and were likely piecing together just who Silas' handler was. Old Brahma wasn't exactly a covert figure. His personality would never allow for that. This seemed to flip the tables, but rather than being put off, Silas instead felt a little more focused. The state of completeness of Tyria's Rhino Warlord armor was disappointing. But her foundation as a member of a C-grade race just might make this interesting. He pulled both of his hands out of his pockets. Come. Tyria didn't seem to need to hear the words twice. The ground shattered beneath her. Speed wasn't her forte, but at a certain level. There was little difference between strength and the pace with which you moved. In a blink, she was already before Silas, her sides coming down like the wind. Their mere unsheathing had caused such a storm, but what really filled one with fear right now was that even as they descended, there wasn't the slightest bit of reaction from the world at all. If her strength could cause such violent winds, it was shocking enough. But what if she could control that strength to the point there was hardly a disturbance at all? Now that was a warrior worth paying attention to. Silas knew instantly that he couldn't take such an attack head-on. The problem wasn't that it was over 7 figures in strength, it was how concentrated it was. The effectiveness of the strike was off the charts, and worse than that, Silas could already see the second strike coming. It would be a continual avalanche if he just stood there to take it head-on. Glass Vault Shift. Runes of lightning sparked into existence, hiding in space and then flickering to reality. Using spatial casting, Silas stamped them in multiples, multiplying them several times over in a single brief instant of time. Then his body flickered. Bolts of green filled the skies and he vanished in an instant, but it felt impossible to tell where he was going. Tyrion's scythe sliced through the ground, cutting through it so cleanly it didn't even make a single sound. But then her blade stopped. Boom! The ground at the end of the curve exploded to her back. The long arc had cut forward and then back in a gorgeous semicircle, but the sudden and abrupt stop caused all the gathering power to explode along it, shattering the earth as though a meteor had just descended. And yet, rather than this being a loss of power, it was more like a transfer. Using the momentum to her back, Tyria took a step forward and suddenly heaved her second scythe forward. Silas had only just appeared when his eyes sharpened. He was taken off guard again. The last thing he expected was for a scythe to be used as a throwing weapon, but it seemed that Tyria had expert control over it. When thrown like that, it would certainly curve back like a boomerang. And even if it wasn't, she likely had telekinesis to rely on, or a special rune to bring it back. He had only just appeared and there was no easy method he could use to stop it. The timing was perfect, and according to Tyria's calculations, Silas' powerful spatial shields needed time to be cast. After all, when he fought Sporide, he had to create many spatial blades before fusing them together. What Tyria didn't know was that this was simply Silas testing out the usefulness of his eyes in a battle of rune masters. The conclusion was very useful. But that didn't mean that he needed them. Or, rather, this didn't mean that he had to rely on them on such a small scale. Even more importantly than that, though, who said that he needed to rely on rune mastery at all to deal with this? Chi. Silas pointed out a finger and then struck it up to the skies. Stopping an attack like this head-on with his telekinesis was impossible. The heft of the blade and the power behind it was beyond the kilograms of strength he could apply. But all of that power was applied forward, not up and down. While its forward momentum would remain the same, nothing would stop Silas from sending it soaring above him except for Tyria's will itself. Chi. A will he shattered to pieces. Bang! The scythe shot above Silas, but a rippling dark violet took shape around him, shingles snapping into place one after another. His arm snapped out and caught the handle of the scythe, nearly causing his shoulder to be ripped out of its socket. Chapter 1275, Tyria. Tyria froze, her eyes widening. Silas stood there in a full scorpion warlord armor, crafted in the mere blink of an eye. Chi, chi, chi. Sparks flew as his claws clamped down on the scythe, slowing its momentum until he flipped once with it. Bang! Silas landed on the ground, slamming the blade into the earth beneath him and leaving it embedded deep and buried. Taking a breath, Silas cracked his neck, his sunglasses shattering beneath bolts of sparking emerald. He took a step forward, his body lowering. But then he suddenly disappeared into the earth, the scythe coming with him. Tyria snapped back to attention immediately. She could completely form the first layer armor, but the second and third were beyond her. However, the reason she had only formed the helm was that she physically couldn't cast that fast. Silas had somehow done it in the blink of an eye and between an imposing action by his will at that. What kind of monster was he? But before she could think about this further, she forced herself to focus. Her intent trained on the second scythe she could sense beneath the ground. Silas was trying to use her own weapon against her, but this was the most foolish thing he could do. He might have shattered her will, but she had other methods of. Bang! The scythe suddenly appeared to her side, but she had already turned toward it. Rather than block, she sidestepped, swinging down toward the ground with all the might she could muster. Boom! The ground erupted into a rain of shattered steel and blooming earth. But she hit nothing at all. Her eyes widened, but a fist had already hit her back. The pain shot through her like sparks of lightning itself, but her body was sturdy. Amongst all the beast warlords, the rhino probably had the greatest defenses. While the scorpion warlord armor was able to disperse damage, the rhino practically directly nullified it. It didn't need such petty tricks. She took a heavy step forward, almost losing her balance, but that didn't stop her from swinging her scythe back in a wild arc. She didn't even get halfway through it. Silas' tail almost carelessly flickered against it, ducking slightly at the same time and sending the wild, uncontrolled strike over his head. He pivoted to her side, slamming out a fist against her liver. She stumbled again, another bout of pain racking her body, but Silas shifted once more. One shift and one attack seamlessly flowed into the next, a series of fists, kicks, elbows, and even knees raining down on Tyr in an avalanche of almost unconscious blows. When the battle began, Silas seemed like a mage completely incapable of close combat. And all of a sudden, he seemed to have eyes in the back of his head and on his limbs themselves, fluidly moving in and out of attack and defensive postures as though he could see the future. And that was because he practically could. He was probably a full 3 steps slower than Tyr, and even more steps weaker in physical strength, but it didn't matter in the slightest. He felt through the echoes in the mesh of reality before she could, his chrono senses tingling as one subtle time rune after another flickered with life and vitality. In such an uncontrolled state, she was even easier to reach. Crack, crack. Her armor was beginning to give way, but Silas didn't show the slightest intent of stopping. He struck a forearm out at the crook of her elbow, stopping yet another side swing far more directly than he had until now. The blow sent a shuddering might through his body that almost knocked him off of his feet, but he managed to weather it, his scorpion warlord armor flickering as the blow was dispersed through his whole body. Stomping a foot to stop the swaying momentum to the side, he drove all the torque of his elbow right up and at her chin. Because of their height difference, it was even easier than usual to snap her jaw in just the right way. However, it was much harder to get the same leverage and momentum that he usually did because of the upward swing. Her head tore to the side, but it wasn't enough to truly rattle her. Even now, Tyr managed to retain a shred of her control, a minuscule amount of her autonomy, and it was the only thing keeping her alive right now. She was waiting, hoping for a chance to turn the situation around. It wouldn't come. Ch. Tyr's eyes widened as her Achilles was suddenly cut. Her own scythe, abandoned and forgotten, suddenly ripped through it at the most inopportune time. She fell to her knee, only to suffer exactly that right up and through her chin. Her head snapped back and the world spun as her rhino helm finally shattered to pieces. If you kill her, it will be a problem. The voice wasn't demanding anything, but instead seemed to be a friendly reminder. It was one thing for an outsider looking to join the sanctum to kill a prospective disciple. But, one prospective disciple killing another prospective disciple was almost like a direct head-to-head challenge between the Scorpion Warlord and the Rhino Warlord. It's too bad she tried to kill me first, then. Isn't it? Silas said calmly. Usually, he wouldn't even bother to explain himself. However, the person who spoke was that man radiating a big cat aura. Silas was arrogant, but his ability to read social cues wasn't stunted. He knew a man trying to make a friend when he saw it, and getting on their ride's bad side, especially when there were pirates to consider, wasn't exactly a smart thing to do. So, he spoke, and as he did so, his movements never stopped for even a moment. His scorpion tail flashed, a perfect, 100 foundation rune sparking with life. For a moment, it looked like a pincer formed of pure lightning. Chi. It pierced right into Tyr's mouth and down her throat. Her body shuddered before it was ripped apart, the poison deconstructing her will first, and then tearing into every other aspect of what made her, her. The sea Tyr had tried to rush forward. Unfortunately for her, she was very right about old Brahma. Chapter 1276, Buddy, Ol Pal. Tyre. The screams of the sea Tyr reverberated, but Silas didn't even look up. He knew that old Brahma would handle it. Instead, he was silently collecting something, while his thoughts roamed. Powerful. This woman was surely that. He seemed to use his rune mastery less in this battle than he would otherwise, but that was because he had a much harder time finding space and the timing to do so, as ironic as that was. It almost felt like a spar between masters. He could see Tyr's counters coming before they did, his luck alerting him to them and forcing him to pivot. In the end, he had to use this far more scheming-like approach to end the battle quickly. Otherwise, it would have gone on for quite a while and more variables would crop up. And most importantly of all, this was an F-tier existence, not an E-tier like he had grown quite used to slaughtering. Of course, Tyr was already a level 50 and already in the process of building her F-grade foundation, something that Silas had yet to begin. Due to that, while they were both level 50, Tyr was still technically leagues beyond him in terms of raw foundation, especially since she was a mutated member of a C-grade race. But even so, it was a wake-up call. If others knew that Silas considered a battle he ended within a few minutes to be a wake-up call, it would be a wonder what they would think. But much the same as he always said, Silas measured his achievements by himself alone. He didn't care very much to compare to others. He had too many advantages to be struggling against a character like Tyr. He still had a lot to learn. Luckily, he could feel that his system wasn't too far away from finally finishing its integration. Something seemed to have sped it up. At first, he thought he would have to wait until Earth had fully integrated, but it seemed he wouldn't have to. Bang, bang, bang. Silas cast a glance up before he went to help Jalla and Alex to their feet. They looked like they had been through a world war of their own just trying to survive. Was she an E-tier too? Jalla asked almost a bit too softly, as though he already knew the answer. No. Jalla sighed. Although Silas had dispatched her easily, he could see that he had struggled with her more than many of the E-tiers Jalla had seen him fight. The world was far larger than he knew. Bang! A pair of bodies fell from the air in a heavy, pile-driving motion, a pair of jet-fueled engines attached to their bodies as though helping them to fly, when in reality, they were doing anything but. They smashed against the hull of the starship and all of the bones in their bodies were crumbled to ash, their inner organs turning to mush. The rage and fury in the eyes of the two C-tiers could only fade along with their wills. The jet engines attached to their bodies unwrapped their metallic tentacles and rushed back up to old Brahma, vanishing into his robes as he brushed down his robes and slicked back his sparse white hair. Still got it? Jalla, in a bit of a foul mood, almost made a snappy retort. But then he realized it wasn't Alex, but an old monster at the C-tier, and he immediately bit his tongue. Oh God, there are two of them now. He suddenly wanted to shed real tears. Old Brahma landed on the ground and gave Silas a look, his eyes flickering toward the two corpses. Or, rather, the remains of them. Silas had left his opponents in an even worse state than old Brahma had left his own. But it made one thing quite obvious. The kid was powerful. Are you sure? Old Brahma asked. Yes. All right. Hey, old man, what do you say to teaching me about those cool gadgets, huh? How about it? Alex grinned. Old Brahma looked over and then directly ignored him. Wait, there's no need to be so stubborn. We can negotiate. Listen, I know this Silas character, you might want to take him under your wings but he'll just end up adding your precious legacy like a cog in his wheel before moving on to the next thing. I'm the only one who will truly cherish your things. Alex's eyes sparkled and Jalla felt another wave of disgust coming over him. He really didn't know if Alex, with all this intelligence, knew the word shame at all. Old Brahma's head tilted, looking back at Alex with a slight hint of amusement. You want me to teach a tailor my path. You must want to make me a laughingstock. Hey, I'm actually pretty sure my profession would synergize quite well with your mech path. Oh, old Brahma's eyes flashed. He didn't need Alex to tell him that, he had already seen it. What he really wanted to know was whether Alex could see that, and clearly, he had. In fact, from Alex's tone, he had probably noticed quite a while ago. A shame. Old Brahma was hoping that Alex wouldn't have noticed so it would be even easier to say no. There was no point in teaching an idiot his path. But even if Alex wasn't as much of an idiot as he pretended to be, old Brahma neither had the time nor patience. It wasn't just about being lazy either. The weight he held on his shoulders as the most powerful of what remained of the gold lineage couldn't be so easily forgotten. The only reason he offered to teach Silas was because he didn't have much of a choice under the contract, and in order to save his granddaughter. If Silas wanted to learn, fine. But he wouldn't set aside time for someone he had no relationship with. Old Brahma had only just had the thought before Alex shamelessly rushed up to Silas. Hey, SYL, buddy, old pal. The old man won't teach me, but he'll teach you. How about you ask a few questions here and there and let me eavesdrop? Alex's eyes twinkled. Chapter 1277, Fugitives. There was a shudder and the starship took off. Silas stood by a window, looking out as the planet receded from his sight. All around him, there were what were meant to be luxuries, but they seemed a bit dim and dull compared to what he should have received considering how much they had paid. Of course, at least for now, money was no object to Silas. The Golden Grove might be a medium-sized power in this sector, but they were still a merchant guild. In addition, the entire wealth of a power in the hands of just one person would always be quite a pretty sum. But after his time with Andromeda, Silas had a strong understanding of the market and pricing systems in the sector. He had specifically dedicated time to exactly that. Not understanding how much things should cost seemed like an unimportant weakness, but in action, it might be life and death in many situations. Not only did understanding this allow him to know how much someone of his standing should be capable of spending, it also helped him not to get scammed. Now, however, he felt like he was getting a bit scammed. It took 90,000 C-grade ether stones to take this ship. Of course, they were fragmented as this sector didn't seem to have any above that grade, but even so, that many quality ether stones was absolutely ridiculous. You could buy 2 level 151 C-grade treasures for that price in the FF Plus range. In the entire Golden Grove, one of the 3 largest merchant guilds in the whole sector, they might only have a couple dozen or so of those weapons to sell a month. But you needed to be able to buy 2 of them just to ride this starship for a month. This was clearly the Beast Warlord Sanctum's method of making money. Though, to be fair, Silas had picked up the most luxurious room they had. Even if he hadn't, though, the lowest price there was only about half the price Silas had paid, and yet the only thing you got for that was a chance to huddle up in a hall while hoping pirates didn't attack. All of those candidates joining with D-tier handlers were down there. Silas looked toward the door before the knock came. After a moment, he slowly stood to his feet and opened eye. On the other side, a certain big cat ship captain stood, towering over Silas. Silas had grown quite considerably the moment he got his human symbioid gene class. By now, he was already approaching 7 feet, but this man would have towered even over Tyr, standing at almost 9 feet tall. On Earth, a person with those proportions would seem almost, well, disproportionate. But this man was built solidly, his muscles a wiry mesh of thin steel cords that pulsed with a radiant power. It looked like he could shatter a hole in the void with a flick of his finger. Looking at him up close, he could see those delicate teardrop pupils reminiscent of a feline, and his hair was no less wild than Silas' own, but shaggier and far less well kept, making it look more like the mane of a lion than the hair of a man. But aside from this, he looked quite human. In fact, he reflected Silas in a lot of ways, even down to his clawed nails. Yes, Silas asked. I'm Captain Heirs, as you've probably already heard. I came here today to let you know that there have been some reports of some potential, well, stowaways on that ship that might be related to the pirates. Silas understood what he meant immediately. They weren't real stowaways, but instead people who had probably bought tickets. They were lying in wait for the time. What Silas actually found interesting, though, was that the captain had come to tell him this. This captain had also been the one to inform them of the ticket prices. For a captain, he sure had a lot of time on his hands. Old Brammer, Silas called out. The old man was lazily reclining on a couch, a hat covering his head. Those 3 pirate groups you mentioned, how much information is there about them? Old Brammer nodded a bit as though trying to arrange his thoughts. 2 are led by fugitives, 1 is led by a beast as far as I understand it. Fugitives, from? Oh, you might not know. But sectors like ours are powerful enough to help people grow, but not strong enough for real powerhouses to care much about. Fugitives are people marked by systems of higher sectors with demerits. They rush down from the higher sectors so that the difficulty of weathering the demerits becomes lesser. The system won't care about petty crimes like these. Why are they fugitives, then? Silas asked. The system definitely wouldn't waste time punishing pirates. You got demerits for doing things against the system's wishes, not just attacking your fellow man. If that was all it took, Silas would be swimming in demerits. Though, it was a shame that Silas was back to neutral ground after helping Kasari out. He missed having his progenitor merit. It had helped him out considerably before. But this was still much better than having demerits. Old Brammer shrugged. Who knows? In all likelihood, poor bastards got tricked or offended the wrong person. If they had really done something bad, the system would have smitted them on the spot. But now there are problems to deal with apparently. And you said that one of them is a beast. What kind of beast? Old Brammer chuckled. A scorpion. More accurately, the fiercest race of scorpion in the Sanctum's galaxy. They say that it descended from the King Scorpion your warlord armor is based on. The Black Ray Scorpion. Silas had actually been hoping to hear that it was a snake, but if it was a C-tier like old Brahma said, even if it was, he wouldn't be able to do anything to it. Finally, Silas looked back toward the captain. Why did you come and tell me this personally? Chapter 1278, Above You. Captain Hares looked at Silas for a moment, not answering immediately. He seemed like quite the serious man for a moment until he suddenly began to chuckle. This is your right, is it not? I can't interfere directly to help you. I am not of the Scorpion lineage, and even if I was, that would only be more reason why I could not. But you are still a disciple in waiting. You still deserve some advantages. Silas nodded slowly. In that case, let me talk to the people down below. Captain Hares blinked in surprise. I won't be making any unilateral decisions. I just want to speak to them. But then you will alert them that we know. As things are right now, do you have any leads on who they might be? Captain Hares paused for a long while before shaking his head no. In that case, the information is useless as is. They might not even care that you know so long as they can continue to protect their identities. They'll just wait for the right moment and then stab you in the back. After a long while, Captain Hares nodded. All right, you can, but I can't give you official capacity to do anything. Also, just talking, no attacking, no killing, no threatening. Ultimately, this is still a ship of the Sanctum and acts as a good portion of their income. I understand, Silas said calmly. It seemed that Captain Hares would have it seem like he was acting independently. That would put quite some pressure on Silas, actually. Because he was already a target to begin with, if he also pissed the people scrunched up together down there as well, once the pirates really did come, their aim would certainly be the get back. However, Silas didn't seem to find a problem with this, bid farewell to the captain, and then closed the door. Old Brahma peeked out an eye from beneath his hat. Are you sure? It seemed to be the old man's favorite phrase. By now, Silas had gotten a feel for exactly what he meant when he said it, though. Won't be a problem. Silas picked up his trench coat from the hanger, slid it on, and then left, his feet light and his gait balanced. The hangar down below was packed. The ship had seemed enormous from the outside, but right now barely 300 or so people were crammed into a single hall, huddled together with just a few faint lines separating them and allowing for walking lanes. Silas' appearance immediately caught the attention of most despite the relatively loud noise. There were probably hundreds of different conversations going on at once, and while they didn't stop, it sounded as though the volume had decreased by half. It's come to my attention that there's likely a few pirates on board. The ship captain and crew won't do anything about it, so will be acting in the capacity of the 713th Scorpion Warlord's disciple. There was an uncomfortable shuffle almost immediately, and Silas could see that some were already dissatisfied with this. Unexpectedly, there was someone who actually spoke out after a brief pause. To be accurate, that isn't exactly the case, now is it? Silas looked over to find a young man with a gruff, leathery appearance. He had a belly as round and full as a moon, and his skin's texture was quite reminiscent of Tyria, but his aura, while he seemed well suited to the Rhino Warlord path, wasn't actually Skarzik. You are a disciple in waiting. You won't be an official disciple until you pass the test. You have no authority here. There were many nods in agreement. No one wanted to be needlessly questioned when they were already so uncomfortable to begin with, least of all by some F-tier child. There were far too many D-tiers here for them to bow and scrape for someone who wasn't even a real disciple yet. Plus, even if there was the threat of pirates here, if the captain couldn't do anything about it, how was Silas going to? You're quite wrong, though that line of thinking might make you feel better. Do you know the reason I can stand here with this badge on my hip and yet none of you dare to do anything? Do you know why I learned of the potential pirates here before you all? Why it is I even have this badge in the first place? The test is of the Beast Warlord Sanctum itself. I stand here as someone who's already done something you could not. I've already been acknowledged by Grelith Duskthorn. Even if I die before stepping foot into the Sanctum, that remains true, and that leaves me as someone who is above you in every way. The young man felt his mind shake and his vision waver. It wasn't until his D-tier handler put out a hand to block his vision from Silas that he finally recovered. That's enough. The handler protected his young charge to his back. Since you two are so talkative, you can go first. Silas stepped forward and a rotating series of runes flashed around him, the mesh of reality bending and twisting. It looked like he was still standing right where he was. And yet, he and the duo seemed an entire world away. The hangar of people watched as the D-tier tried to establish some dominance, his aura radiating out. But Silas just stood there, unbothered and unmoved. Their hearts shook. How was an F-tier ignoring the gap in aura against a D-tier? What was happening? They couldn't hear what was happening at all. And somehow, when they tried, it felt like their senses were sinking into an endless black hole, being swallowed up by something else entirely. What they didn't know was that Silas was using the hibernation realm right now. To them, their senses might as well have been a drop falling into the ocean. Silas was exactly that. A world away. Chapter 1279, Choked. The bubble burst and Silas calmly walked forward toward the next group, leaving the Skarsgård lookalike and his handler in a bit of a daze. Even now, they weren't 100% certain of what had happened. It felt like they had just been trapped, only to be released moments later. The perception of the D-tier was odd and twisted, like he couldn't grasp exactly what had happened. But even now, he didn't want to believe it. No, it was impossible for an F-tier to do something like that to him. The only explanation was that someone was helping him, but that only made the D-tier all the more apprehensive. If Silas was getting that kind of help, then it wasn't up to him to interfere. He made his charge sit down in silence. And just like that, everyone else fell in line. Silas hid his fatigue behind his stoic face, satisfied with the outcome. He understood people. It didn't matter if they were alien races or not. They were all the same at the end of the day. The only way to hold power was to exert yourself once, only then could you relax and use an easier, more manageable approach. It didn't have to necessarily be fear, but you needed respect and deterrence. Where that came from didn't matter for the time being. The D-tier might think that Silas had gotten outside help, but this wasn't the case at all. Instead, Silas relied on the hibernation realm. Hibernation Halo was an interesting ability. Originally, its purpose was to extend the recovery abilities of the hibernation realm into an external form. Thanks to the synergy between his three legendary paths, Silas was able to take advantage of this even to heal himself so long as he was in a state of full fusion. Obviously, he wasn't in such a state now, and he also didn't need any healing, so that wasn't what he had used it for. What made the ability so interesting was the fact that it was projecting an ability. It wasn't the ability in itself. After Silas' Vipermancy had progressed to bronze, this ability, too, had undergone a change, and it allowed him to use the hibernation halo as a projection of his world, imposing it onto the outside. Due to his control over his own world being far beyond his control of any other, Silas made use of his time runes to change the speed with which time flowed by for the D-tier, making him experience what should have been entire minutes in the outside world as split moments instead. Due to this, the D-tier couldn't react because his mind physically wasn't fast enough to even realize that there was something wrong to react against in the first place. Silas had no ability to fight a D-tier head-on, and certainly not one who could openly go about their business in this sector. Though he was a mere handler, it definitely took some doing and status to take charge of such an important resource of a family or organization. But he didn't have to fight them head-on if he could make them think they weren't fighting. During that period, Silas took his time to interrogate the Skarsgård lookalike, gaining all the information he wanted before releasing the both of them. Then, he went to the next group, and then the next. This time, everyone was silent and obedient, and Silas only had to use his hibernation halo to put up a spatial barrier others couldn't see through, something that was orders of magnitude easier than manipulating time. It hardly took any effort at all. Still, as Silas continued his interrogation, he couldn't help but feel that he needed better recovery methods. Unfortunately, maddened enlightenment had fallen far behind madness control. Since he evolved it from maddened meditation, he hadn't progressed it at all, and it was still the same FF+ skill, and it was next to useless to him. He couldn't remember the last time he had even bothered to use it actively. Maybe he would have to look into that. It was just unfortunate he felt like he had a million things to do but not nearly enough time to do it. Eventually, Silas went to the end of it all, finishing off his interrogation. "Thank you all for your cooperation." After saying this, Silas turned and left, not saying another word. The murmurs in the hangar returned and a few sinister gazes flashed. But, they didn't seem to deem it worthwhile to do much of anything right now. Silas returned to his room to find that old Brammer was still lounging while Alex and Jalla were playing some sort of odd tabletop game that utilized runes. It only took Silas a glance to see through it. He was partially curious about what people in the wider universe did for entertainment. It wasn't as though he had had all the time in the world to check on that while he was running for his life everywhere. But that game would certainly not be any fun for him. Not unless he was playing against a decent E-tier rune master at the very least. He cast a glance toward old Brammer, who more than fit the description. Unfortunately, he was still not in a place where fun could be had. It seemed that he was in another ridiculous situation. Old Brammer peeked up from his hat, eyeing Silas as though waiting for him to say something. "The numbers aren't bad. There are 27 D tier and 13 E and F tiers for a total of 53. Old Brammer's lip twitched. "Aren't bad." That was almost 20% of the people that had boarded this time. If that number of traitors was on board and timed the period of descent just right, they'd all be finished. If it was anyone else who said something so ridiculous, old Brammer would have called them out for being a lying bastard. Well, at least there aren't any C tiers. There were never C tiers amongst them to begin with. Why would they need them when the captain is in on it? Old Brammer almost choked on air. Chapter 1280, You're Sure? This time, old Brammer was on high alert. He sat up from his reclined position, looking at Silas intently. "You're sure about this? You only need to think about it." Old Brammer opened his mouth for a snarky reply, but then seemed to think better of it. "You'll get used to it, old man. I could help you through this troubled time, though, if you just help me out with some of your valuable knowledge." Old Brammer ignored Alex. He wanted to ask Silas to explain, but Silas didn't seem to care to. But when he thought about it, one thing did stand out. The pirates were anything but stupid if they were capable of targeting potential disciples of the Sanctum and yet remained until now. So why would they send a bunch of D-, E, and F tiers? It might make sense under usual circumstances. But, what of the Skarzik and Servadan? There were 2 C tiers there, 2 C tiers that would have been on board if Silas hadn't randomly appeared, causing them to die at old Brammer's hands. Silas and the others arrived last minute, but those 2 C tiers had been present for quite a long while, mingling amongst the D tiers. They would know they were there. And they wouldn't necessarily be able to afford the same rooms as Silas could either. Which meant, the odds they would be in the hangar when the attacks came would be high. So why would they be confident in doing things like this? The obvious answer seemed to be a timing issue. They would just wait until the C tiers were occupied before they sprung their traps. But this wouldn't likely be the case either. Those C tiers had only one priority: to protect their charges. There was no way they would pay so much to be on the starship, and then act in any capacity that would put that in jeopardy. In fact, the mere fact that they were taking this starship meant they were aware of the dangers and were ready to weather them. However, this still wasn't enough. Just what was Silas seeing that he wasn't? There were a million ways to manipulate them into a situation where they would at least leave the other D tiers unprotected by their influence, allowing the stowaways to counter. And then there was the elephant in the room. The only reason Silas knew to check the hangar for traitors in the first place was because of the captain. Why would the captain put such a thought into Silas' mind when it would only be to his detriment? But that was when it hit him. Silas had already said it. It was odd that the captain had come to tell him these things personally, given his standing. The explanation Captain Hayes had given for why he had done so was decent enough, but that didn't explain something else. Why would a captain be the one to give a general spiel about starship prices and rules? Wasn't that also beneath him? To do one made enough sense. Why would he do both? Old Brammer suddenly understood then that Silas had been suspicious of the captain from the moment he opened the door. That was why Silas had outright asked him why he came personally. If the captain said that it was just his duty and this was how he liked to do things, then it was fine. But he had specifically spoken like he was giving Silas special treatment. If he was doing this just for Silas, then why had he been the one to introduce them all to the rules of the ship before he even knew Scylla's was present? Unlike Scylla's, Tyria had hidden her status until it was time to fight him. She wasn't nearly as bold or confident in her ability to survive. So, it certainly couldn't have been for her. But wasn't it so very interesting that the captain's appearance had allowed him to witness everything he needed to? From Scylla's, to old Brahma's strength, to Tyria's status as an inane disciple as well. It was the perfect place for the head of an operation to be. That way he could make the best decisions moving forward. As for why he had come to tell Scylla's something like he had personally, it was hard to say what his exact motive was. To have them lower the guards against him. Maybe, but it felt deeper than that. It was a test of Scylla's character, to see what sort of person he was, what sort of buttons he could press, and how he could manipulate the situation to better suit him in the future. For a double agent like Captain Heir's, Scylla's existence was both a boon and a potential death trap. One wrong step and the gig that had netted him so much could come crumbling down. Even when he spoke out to Scylla's, warning him about how his actions might offend the Rhino lineage, that was his attempt at getting closer to Scylla's. But back then, Scylla's response had left him a bit surprised. Scylla's was more sociable than he thought he would be, so he realized that he wasn't as easy to manipulate as an arrogant genius would be, so he needed a heavier hand. Captain Heir's was smart. He knew that it was impossible to gain something without giving up something in return. You couldn't make large sums in a gambling den unless you were willing to put up a large amount of collateral first. So he pushed his chips to the center of the table. It was just too bad he had no idea his opponent was Scylla's Grimblade, the dominus paragon the entire sector was in the middle of looking for right this moment. Old Brahma was still certain that there were some things he was missing, but looking towards Scylla's, he decided to just let his mind fall at ease. It was fine, just let the boy do as he please. It seemed that even his own mind couldn't keep up. Then what do you want to do? How confident are you in hijacking a ship like this one? This concludes the chapters for today. To continue the journey, be sure to find the next chapters on our channel. If you're excited about this story as we are, please like this video and subscribe. You can also leave a comment with your thoughts on this chapters.